gaan praten over hoop of pessimisme. Want hij is al decennia lang topcolumnist bij de gerenommeerde krant The Financial Times. Hij schreef talloze boeken en sprak de grote der aarde. En in zijn laatste boek, dit boek, De crisis van het democratisch kapitalisme, beschrijft Martin Wolf de huidige problemen met economie en politiek. En hij trekt parallellen naar het verleden en geeft ook oplossingen voor de toekomst. En het is opgedragen, dit boek, aan zijn kleinkinderen. En in verband met de vertaling sprak ik hem net voor de uitzending.
Well, I wanted this book to be about and for the future. And my grandchildren are my future in a rather literal sense. I'm close to them, I love them. And they are, I hope, going to live in a peaceful, prosperous, reasonably stable world for another 100 years, possibly. And I want that to be a good world. And this book is written because I'm not quite sure it will be. Yeah. So that's why I dedicated it to them.
Do they ever disagree with your analysis?
They're not old enough to do so. Their parents do, my children.
Really?
My oldest grandchild is 15. He's getting to the age when he begins to realize how wrong adults are about everything. But my other grandchildren are all 8 and younger, and they still think adults know what they're doing.
Your children disagree, though, right?
Oh, well, a little bit. I mean, actually, we are a very close family, but my children are, as I would hope, people with minds of their own, and so we argue quite frequently. But the person I argue with most is my wife.
Oh, I see. Oh, that sounds healthy. Now, this book, it's somehow, you write about pessimism as if it's a virtue. What has pessimism brought you?
Well, I sometimes think it's just realism, but perhaps that's a bit too optimistic. I argue that basically I'm often accused of being a pessimist, and I have 2 big defenses of this. One is that means that most of the surprises in my life, with a few exceptions, have been pleasant ones, because things have turned out better than I feared they might. And the second is, I think it's very, very important, is if you are a pessimist, you recognize things can go seriously wrong, you begin to think about what you can do to prevent that from happening. Yeah. So I think all the people who are alarming themselves about climate now are pessimists, because they're very worried about what will happen if nothing will be done. And nothing changes unless people realize that things can go wrong.
But you have a very personal relation to pessimism. You actually, I think you write, if I quote you correctly, that it saved your life, really.
Well, it's why I exist. It didn't save my life.
Can you explain?
In the purely metaphysical sense.
Yeah.
My argument is I exist because of 2 pessimistic men. One of them was my father, who left Vienna in 1937 at the age of 27. He was Jewish, as my mother was, and he realized what might happen. So he decided to leave for England. And if he hadn't done so, he would certainly have been killed, as most of his wider family was. And my other savior, if that's the right word, was my grandfather, my mother's father, who was a fish merchant here in Holland, in Emden. And when the Nazi armies crossed the Dutch border, he got hold of a trawler. We still don't quite know how. He got his family onto the trawler. His immediate family had 5 children, his wife as well, and a nanny. He asked all his family, his big family, he was one of 9, to join him. None of them did. He got across to England. His family survived. Most of them came back, not my mother who met my father, after the war. But the rest of his family were, without exception, exterminated.
Yeah.
So I exist because of 2 people who realized that things could go very, very, very wrong.
Yeah, and in your book, you do warn for similar scenarios. You warn for the existence of tribalism. Why?
Well, I think, actually, I started writing this book when, in 2016, because of what was happening in America and Britain. I think now, looking at what Putin is doing, this is extreme versions of tribalism. The statement that Russia is entitled to claim absolute control over anybody that they decide is part of the Russian world. That's an extreme version of this. Obviously, throughout history, the tribal motivation both makes human societies stick together, which is valuable, and it also makes them want to destroy one another, not merely just fight one another, destroy one another. And and of course it can tear societies apart. That's what happened in Europe between the wars. That has enormous personal significance for the reasons I've said. And I begin to see similar sorts of tribal forces at work in our world today. And the war in Ukraine is a pretty horrifying example.
Yeah, this book is about the economy and politics. And it's only 20 years ago you wrote a book, Why Globalization Works. So your thinking has changed. Do you remember the moment that happened?
Well, my thinking on globalization as an economic process has not changed as much as although it has certainly changed. But I think for me, there have been two hugely significant events. And I blame myself for not having seen this coming. But the first was the financial crisis.
In 2008.
In 2008, which made it obvious that the financial underpinnings of our system were much more fragile than I had realized. I knew they were fragile, but much more fragile. So that was the first thing. Yeah. And the second was the clear signs of erosion of democratic order, of the stability of the democratic systems that had evolved in America and Britain, which were obviously two of the most important democratic societies. Yeah. The clear signs of erosion, which were encapsulated and embodied in Trump's election as president and the Brexit vote. Yeah. So that started making me think, well, not only is our financial system not stable, neither necessarily is our political order.
Yeah. The book is called The Crisis of Democratic Capitalism. But is it fair to say that there is a crisis because capitalism itself hasn't turned out to be very democratic?
Well, that's one way of thinking about it. I think what we have had is, or the way, when I started thinking about this hard, I thought something like this. We have the political and economic systems of the Western world, and increasingly of the world, though that varies massively across, are capitalism, the market economy broadly defined. That is now pretty near universal as a core system, which has evolved over the recent centuries. And in about half the world, and particularly in the Western world, the political system is democratic. The idea is we choose our leaders through competitive elections, and we accept the legitimacy of the winners of those elections. That's the core idea of democracy. And I wanted to ask myself, how did these two things go together, and how do they stay together?
Yes.
And the argument I make is they are complementary opposites. They need each other. It's pretty obvious democracy, in my view, was one of those unexpected children of the market revolution, both in positive ways and in negative ways. They need each other, but they fight each other. And they fight each other most powerfully, which follows from your question, if the market economy doesn't work very well. Yeah. And there are a large number of dissatisfied people. People feel that their economic position, which is also a social position, they're obviously always related, is deteriorating. Yeah. They get anxious and concerned. They then start looking for people to blame. Yeah. And often in history, and the best example of that in history was in the 30s in Germany, they turn to a savior who says, forget all this democracy stuff. Trust in me, I'm your leader. I will look after you against all these terrible enemies you have. And that then leads you to demagogic populism and authoritarianism. And that's, I think, what's going on.
Your book is directed at the elites. Why?
Well, because ultimately, there are two related reasons. All complex societies, without exception, so anything much above a tribal society, has elites. We are hierarchical. We seem to be quite hierarchically inclined animals, and our societies have elites. There can be predatory elites, very common, indeed almost the norm in history. But sometimes elites come to realize that they actually have a very strong interest in a peaceful, stable, and even democratic society. That has happened in the past in the West. I think it was a great achievement. Yeah. But this is a potentially temporary situation. If elites become predatory, incompetent, excessively selfish and narrow-minded, they lose the confidence of the people at large. Yeah. They fail to make their economies and societies work properly. They make huge mistakes, and then they open themselves to the anti-elitism we see now, which these demagogic populists capture. That's essentially what they do. They say, forget all those people. They're all crooks. They're all gangsters. Let me look after you. And the person who does that is always, nearly always, in fact, always a worse crook or gangster than the one they're trying to replace.
You give us not only pessimism, thankfully, but also solutions. Not one big one, but many small ones. But one of them, you argue, I heard you say on a podcast with Gideon Rachman, is we need more economic growth. Now that's something that's heavily debated under younger generations, for instance. So why do you think that can work?
Well, that's a really important question. I believe that democratic societies have emerged. They've emerged for many reasons, but one of the reasons they've emerged is that because democracy works on consent. It works on everybody accepting the legitimacy of the situation. And what a market economy with its growth did is it made it possible for the society to have what I call positive sum politics, which means a politics in which everybody could have more. And because of that, it was possible to attenuate and limit the massive internal conflicts over resources that are the classic symptoms of organized human life. Yeah. There's more for everybody. So I think politically it is almost unimaginable we would have had democracy without growth. I also actually think that economic growth has quite obviously brought us staggering advances across a huge range of activities. Just look at the most obvious. Our life expectancies have gone up roughly 2.5 times since the early 19th century. So growth has brought and does bring enormous benefits. Then we get to the point, if we have zero growth, how do we stop it? What do we do about all the countries that are now desperately poor? Do we tell them they can't grow? Are we telling the people in Africa that they can never get as rich as we are? That's obviously impossible. They're going to have to grow. And that means that even if we stop growing, the world economy is going to continue to grow. So we can't stop it.
No, it seems to me that this is also about redistribution. And the last time we fundamentally redistributed wealth was when all the wealth was gone or demolished after the Second World War. How do you persuade elites, the elite that you are part of and you know so well, to still act against their own interest without avoiding such a crisis?
Well, I think that is the core question, and I don't have an answer. The evidence we have from the past is that really major redistributions occur at times of total societal breakdown. Yeah. So the next catastrophe, similarly to World War II, namely World War III, will be global thermonuclear war, and that's not a policy solution. That's going to kill at least 3/4 of humanity. So we can forget that. Yeah. So the catastrophes that might befall complete climate disasters, similarly, things that aren't really survivable. So I am hoping, I agree, people can say that's naive, that we can persuade people, and I think it's beginning to happen in some countries, but we'll see. It's beginning to happen, I think, in the United States, though it's not obvious yet how far that will go, that it is actually in their interest to have a stable, peaceful, democratic society rather than a civil war or a societal collapse, which is what they're looking at. Why should they want to be ruled by Donald Trump or somebody like him? Yeah. We can't make catastrophe the solution, so it has to be something different.
Wise words. Thank you, Mr. Wolf, for this conversation.
It was a great pleasure.
Bedankt voor het kijken. Vond je dit een goed gesprek? Vergeet je dan niet te abonneren. Een like of een reactie achterlaten kan natuurlijk ook. Of bekijk een van de andere interviews op dit kanaal.